First, I'm Mark Eichman along with Shirley Min. The driverless car isn't science fiction anymore. The question is, where does Delaware fit on the autonomous car superhighway?
And as we look to the future, we also reflect on the past when it comes to race relations. A large group talks about Wilmington 1968 and the impact 50 years later after the death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
He was a philanthropist and an accomplished painter. First Experience takes in an exhibit of the works of George A. Weymouth.
First, your public media news magazine starts now.
The race is on to find the car of the future, but just what form it will take and how we'll all adjust to the highway of tomorrow is still a big question. While the technology of self-driving cars gets most of the attention, there's a lot of tech being added to Delaware's road infrastructure. It's where we start this week's First Look. These robotic cars driving around a miniature city at the University of Delaware in Newark offer a glimpse at what real-world autonomous driving could look like. With 35 robotic cars running on this scale smart city, UD researchers are developing algorithms to help coordinate autonomous vehicles as they merge and maneuver on the roads.
This is a scale city. This is a scale vehicle 1 to 24. We can't really replicate the exact behavior of a vehicle, but it can help us address concepts or issues, challenges that we will be addressing down the road in the real environment.
This smart city testbed is also exploring how self-driving cars respond when sharing the road with human drivers, as simulated by these other students at UD. They're also working with brain science researchers and public policy folks at UD to explore the consequences of autonomous cars. For instance, if they make commutes much more efficient for drivers, does that mean even more people will be using their cars to get to work?
This environment can help us think outside the box and see how we can, redesign a city and use technologies to improve efficiency, sustainability, make life easier. We've made a lot of progress, but we still have a long way to go.
In March, there was a tragic example of how autonomous vehicles are not ready to roll out just yet, as a public road test by Uber in Arizona resulted in the death of a pedestrian. And while there's no public road tests underway in Delaware, car makers are adding more and more self-driving features in cars now hitting showroom floors. From Tesla's Autopilot to Cadillac's Super Cruise, levels of automation are slowly being added to cars now on the roads. And the state is working right now to figure out how to prepare for the arrival of more autonomous cars.
We're really just trying to focus on how do we position Delaware to be a leader in the connected and autonomous vehicle world.
Since November, DelDOT Secretary Jennifer Cohan has led an advisory council exploring complex issues surrounding autonomous cars.
We talk to the manufacturers and the owners of these technologies and these vehicles. Their technology is sound, it's here, it's working, so they want to deploy. So we're in a really good position to have them come here and actually deploy in real time. So that's what our focus is going to be.
The council includes input from transportation leaders, Department of Insurance folks, and lawmakers.
It's a matter of time before this happens. And with Delaware being a small state, we can react, we can get together, we can react quickly to get our infrastructure ready and prepared so that when these higher levels of autonomous vehicles hit the roads, the level 3 through 5, we actually have the infrastructure in place, we actually have the laws in place.
The council recently got an update from Toyota on the company's plans to test autonomous vehicles in Tokyo during the 2020 Olympics.
It's exciting. We're going to see a lot of different emerging pilot tests in different areas, and you heard today that Delaware will be out there in some of the pilots that are happening in the technology space, because we want to make sure that safety stays number one in all topics, pilot test and any executions that we might experience here in Delaware or anywhere else.
For years, Delaware's road infrastructure has been upgraded with autonomous vehicles in mind.
F133, 113 and Road 207.
Here inside DelDOT's Transportation Management Center, workers monitor traffic conditions throughout the state. All but 30 of Delaware's more than 900 traffic lights are controlled out of this room in Smyrna. Gene Donaldson has overseen development of this tech for the past 2 decades.
Going to autonomous vehicles is the next phase of this program. So we've already invested in a lot of the infrastructure that would be required.
There are Bluetooth receivers throughout the state that send speed and volume information DelDOT uses to monitor traffic. Those could be used to transmit info to autonomous cars.
Over the last 20 years, like with everything, it's more and more at the core of what we do is technology. It's software, more and more advanced software, even to the level where we're starting to look at artificial intelligence.
Artificial intelligence is being used to coordinate traffic lights along Route 40 and 896 in the Bear-Glasgow area right now.
It's running right now with artificial intelligence, so it's looking at all the traffic that's coming from our detectors. It's looking at other systems we have and traffic signal data. And then it's learning. It has already learned. It can separate rush hour from a problem, which is pretty good.
Later this year, the Council on Autonomous Vehicles will issue its final report with recommendations on how the state should regulate self-driving cars moving forward, all with the goal of making Delaware roads safer for all users.
If you put it into perspective, about 37,000 people lost their lives on the roadways in this country last year, and 96% of that is based on human error. If we can reduce that in half, I mean, it's just a phenomenal opportunity.
While there are rapid developments in the world of self-driving cars, there are still so many questions about how this all will be rolled out. For instance, if an autonomous car is making all the decisions on the road, how do you computerize the ethics of driving? If there was a decision to be made about crashing into another car or crashing into a pedestrian, how do you make that decision? How do you teach the car to make that decision?
And do we want the car to make that decision?
Exactly.
Well, you know, you were saying that there's artificial intelligence running the traffic lights in Glasgow. How's that working?
Yeah, it's a really cool project that DelDOT's been working on, and the computer is getting pretty good at adjusting the lights in response to traffic demands. So, for instance, in the morning during rush hour, if a lot of cars are turning to go towards I-95, the green arrow to let them turn can stay green longer to alleviate all that backup, and the computer can figure out that that's what needs to happen and accomplish it.
Okay, so what about the real-world tests of driverless cars in Delaware?
Not happening as of right now. There's no testing of cars on public roads. But DelDOT says no one is even asked to test, like Uber was testing out in Arizona where that tragic accident happened last month. But state law is really silent as of now on whether a test would be allowed and who would have to approve such a test. So that's part of what the Autonomous Vehicle Council's report will address later this year, among other things. Also coming later this year will be a pair of self-driving buses being tested at the University of Delaware's campus in Newark, and they're going to work with the Autonomous Lab at UD to get that rolling.
I don't know how I feel about all this.
You and a lot of other people have the same concerns. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Mark. You can read more about what the future holds for Delaware roads at WHYY.org/news.
He's a philanthropist and an accomplished artist. His works are now part of a display at the place he helped create. Check out First Experience in about 10 minutes here on WHYY TV. Last week, WHYY and its community partners, the Christina Cultural Arts Center and the Metropolitan Wilmington Urban League, hosted Wilmington 50 years after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
The civil rights leader would have been 89 years old had he not been gunned down. Wilmington, 50 years after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., gave community leaders and attendees a chance to chime in about how far Wilmington has come racially, socially, and economically for African Americans since King's death. The discussion was held at the Delaware History Museum. Economists, psychologists, sociologists, and activists all shared their ideas and suggestions on what can be done to achieve racial and economic equality for blacks in America. And attendees also had a chance to get involved. From table discussions to questions for the panel, many came prepared to roll up their sleeves and get to work on sharing ideas and hopes for a better Wilmington.
The panel made a really good discussion about not only focusing on what we have done wrong, but kind of looking towards the future. And I think one of the things that we really need is community involvement. and really community awareness and education on the problems, because just as clear as it was, for some people to understand and kind of see the gains and some of the losses, everyone doesn't have that perspective or have the education or the background, the insight or the knowledge, the access even to knowledge to figure out some of the things that may seem like we've gained but not necessarily gained.
We've talked in this assembly about the stratification of society, that people don't reach outside of their own silos. Perhaps social networks have even contributed to this problem. And I think that people don't reach out more because they're afraid. Well, perhaps in some cases afraid of physical harm, but in a lesser degree afraid of being ostracized by their own group, perhaps for reaching out, or just feeling anxious to be in intimate contact with someone who is unlike themselves.
I feel like attending these, which I found on Facebook, but attending these type of discussions also give people like me the ability to learn and explore how I can be an active agent.
My biggest concern today is for the young people, because I see such a separation of older people and younger people. We're not pulling them along like we should. And I think that's really a serious issue. I take my grandchildren to school every day, and I'm very involved in the school. I mean, I'm called Granny Lyons at the school. That's not even my real name. Good. But because I love the children, they tell me I'm the Pied Piper there. They run to me, gather me. But I see children that need to be hugged and need to be loved. We can say that it's wealth, race, or whatever we want to call it. But if we don't love one another, love is the biggest thing that's separating us. It's a division of, I have a better job than you, or you don't have a job at all. It's got to be love. I've got to love that person, no matter if they live in Southbridge or they live in Greenville. So we've got to know that we've got to care for one another. And the biggest thing I see is being able to bring our young people out of the situations that are in, no matter whether they've been incarcerated or they've been in college for 4 years. We still need to show them that we care about them.
While more still needs to be done, many conceded that there have been social and economic advances for blacks since the late 60s. However, the issue of race, says keynote speaker Derek Hamilton of the New School in New York City, still confines people of color from advancing economically in America. He says that a societal shift in equity fairness will change things.
But what's frequently overlooked in these disparities, and what's even more pronounced, is race becomes a bigger predictor of one's wealth status than class itself. Blacks and Latinos collectively make up about 30% of the U.S. population, but own less than 7% of the nation's wealth. Progressives and liberals, they often make economic productivity arguments to justify a greater emphasis on equity. People say, well, if we provide everybody with capacity, that's going to grow the economy and we'll all be better off. That may be true, but it might not be. My point is that those arguments are context specific. We know that through exploitation, an economy can grow as well. Slavery. I mean, we only have to look at slavery. I prefer the framing of Dr. Martin Luther King and currently Dr. William Barber, where equity, he frames economic justice as a moral imperative. With such an approach, economic inclusion becomes an explicit goal regardless of the context that we live. Basically, we need a societal shift from overemphasizing economic austerity and growth, which leaves workers vulnerable to the fickle contingency of trickle-down job creation. Instead, we need to prioritize equity, fairness, and what the Nobel laureate in economics, Amartya Sen, has labeled human capabilities, where we measure our national economic health by how well we enable all our citizens to attain their self-defined goals. Two things are unambiguous when it comes to racial stratification. One, black workers are made worse off. And two, the capitalist class, which is overwhelmingly white, is made better off. What is ambiguous, and is important when we think about class struggle and unification across race, particularly amongst the working class, is that the economic position of the white working class, that's ambiguous, whether they benefit or lose from stratification. And the reason why is there are tangible material and psychological benefits associated with white privilege and the property rights and whiteness. For instance, high-achieving Black Americans, as measured by education, still exhibit large economic and health disparities relative to their white peers. The fact that Blacks who live in families where the head graduated from college have typically less wealth than white families where the head dropped out of high school is one example of this property right and whiteness. Other examples include Diva Page's study, where she demonstrates that white males that signal prior incarceration have a greater rate of an employment callback than Black males who signal no prior incarceration. And the fact that Black expectant mothers who graduated from college have a greater likelihood of an infant mortality than a white expectant mother who dropped out of high school. So these are material and psychological benefits. But, you know, of course, I would like to think and would like to hope that if there was a coalition, that the working class of Blacks and whites would have greater leverage to bargain with the capital class so as to improve their overall working condition. But if we couch it in terms of a moral imperative, the context becomes irrelevant.
Attendees wouldn't let Hamilton leave without hearing his 10-point plan to achieve this outcome. Here's a brief portion of it.
Reparations for slavery, but not just slavery, Jim Crow, and exclusion from New Deal and post-World War II policies. Wow. To get beyond our race problem, first we need acknowledgement, then we need redress. So could we redress racial inequality without reparations? It would be less efficient, we probably could, but unless you couple the acknowledgement of what took place in the past and in the history and its ongoing effect, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission should conduct employment audits. So rather than passively looking for discrimination, they should proactively go out and detect racial discrimination, especially for firms that receive federal procurement. Federal subsidy to HBCUs to the tune of the present value of support reached for other colleges and universities from the post-World War II GI Bill. Ira Katz-Nelson estimates that that was equivalent to the funding that we put into the Marshall Plan to redevelop Europe. It's evident that Blacks still need stereotype-safe environments to mitigate hostility and to provide curriculum relevant to their experiences. Eliminate tracking in grade school altogether and offer talented and gifted curriculum to everyone. As a result of desegregated schools, we ended up with apartheid-like structures in school where all the high-achieving classes are segregated with white students and the low-achieving classes with Black students. Let's blow it all up and have everything talented and gifted. Single-payer health insurance and tuition-free public universities. For things so crucial to one's economic well-being, the stigma and threat of finance should be removed at the point of delivery. They're not free, but at the point of delivery, we shouldn't have to worry about the stigma of paying for it. The final thing is to stop mass incarceration, especially for nonviolent offenders, and hold police both criminally and civilly responsible for abusive practices.
Program participants and attendees all agreed in order to reach the desired goals, nonprofits, community organizers, residents, and government must work together.
A little later on, you'll hear from local stakeholders on how the racial disparities in Wilmington came to light and what's being done now and in the future to improve the lives of some of Wilmington's most vulnerable residents. Painter and philanthropist George A. Weymouth passed away in 2016. Frolic, as he was known, was one of the founders of the Brandywine Conservancy and the Brandywine River Museum. He was a passionate but private painter. Our first experience is at the Brandywine River Museum for the first retrospective of his art covering 5 decades of painting.
The name of the exhibition is The Way Back, the paintings of George A. Weymouth. Frolic, as he was known to everyone after about 5 minutes, painted for over 5 decades, and we have a retrospective here which shows the full arc of his career. people that knew him well knew he was an artist, but I don't think that they realized the whole scope of his work. He was very private about his work. He was a very public person because of all of his philanthropic work, but he was very private as an artist. So you'll see in this exhibition, there's this very hushed quality, and it's really the people and the places that he knew. He had a very interesting relationship with Andrew Wyeth. One of his aunts took him to meet Andrew Wyeth. Andrew Wyeth was very open, gave him feedback, and then when Frolic graduated from Yale and moved back to Chadds Ford, he got to know Andrew Wyeth, and this was a deep friendship that lasted for decades until Andrew Wyeth's death. I think that there is an unmistakable kind of visual reference in the work to Andrew Wyeth, that same kind of use of light, the very kind of still quality, but I think Frolic really made the work his own. Frolic and Bill Prickett and Francis DuPont were the three founding board members of the Brandywine Conservancy. They really had the idea to save the cultural and natural resources of this area and start an organization that would save the landscape and the artists' work who had lived here. It is interesting to see in the work that this landscape that you see is now all protected by the Brandywine Conservancy, which now has over 64,000 acres of land under protection, including Frolic's 250-acre estate, the Big Bend, which you see a lot of in this work. He's certainly a very important figure to our organization, but also he's a very important artist. So we really wanted to put him in the context of American art. And I think that's very important for us to have people see Frolic's work in that light. Frolic was so passionate about art, so I think he would love the fact that people are here really looking at his work as works of art, not necessarily him as a person, because he was this larger-than-life person, but this is really about his art, and so I think he absolutely would love the fact that people are here looking at this.
Frolic was mentored by Andrew Wyeth and even switched from oil paint to Wyeth's preferred method, egg tempera painting. The Way Back, the paintings of George A. Weymouth, is on view now through June 3rd. You can get more information by visiting the museum on the web at brandywine.org/museum.
Earlier, we told you about an event hosted by WHYY, the Christina Cultural Arts Center, and the Metropolitan Wilmington Urban League. The program was held on April 4th, the day Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. Tonight, we step back in time to reflect on how far we've come and what lies ahead.
We understood why they had killed Malcolm, but we couldn't understand why they would assassinate Dr. King. Everybody was upset because Dr. King being assassinated, and most of our thoughts was, this is the guy who was talking about turning the other cheek. They didn't send in anybody to actually talk to the brothers and sisters to not do the rioting. You know, the rioting came in when they came, and at that time in 1968, the police brutality was even greater than it is right now in this country. We've been miseducated in this country for a long time, so they never, there's three stages of emotion, so they were on the second stage. They wanted to fight back. First one's getting mad, second one is getting even madder, and the third one was striking back. And so the striking back was, let's tear the stores up. Just the feeling of taking something from the oppressor, which wasn't the right thing to do, but we all was upset that Dr. King was killed based on him turning the other cheek and being a nonviolent person.
One thing that we have to recognize is our history. And as we look at, there's nothing more important than education. And I'm not talking about something that starts at 8:30 in the morning and ends at 2:30, 3:30 in the afternoon. I'm talking about your power to gain new knowledge, to learn new knowledge, and to share it. And the history of what happened in 1968 here in the city of Wilmington, and the longest military occupation that this nation has ever seen in peacetime. Who led that? That was led by children and teens and people like my father, who at that time became the very first Black staff photographer for the Delaware News Journal. I think that's the time when Wilmington really started to shift. So for decades, people have been being pushed out, and now we're seeing the why. We're kind of at a different point in the development where now we're seeing those properties redeveloped and other people in other communities being brought in. And we need all of it. We need to bring new ideas, new energy, and diversity in from other parts of the country and the world. My hope is that the people will recognize their power, galvanize together as one village, united, to rebuild our own nation, not just respond to what we see as gentrification, but be a part of the redevelopment.
To be honest, I think that over the past 50 years, too many people in leadership averted their eyes from our neighborhoods, from our poorer residents. And I think it's the mission of this administration to refocus our energies on our neighborhoods. So I think, as in the case throughout America, middle-class people and above have done just fine. But the big deficit has been in the conditions in which our poorer neighbors have lived, and that is their housing stock, where we haven't had pre-rental inspections for over a decade. We're doing that now, and we're finding that people are living in homes and rental housing that none of us would be proud of. And so I think, it's, to be honest, no, I don't think it has been. I don't think that that Dr. King would be very proud at this point. I think obviously there are things that we can all feel really good about, but there are too many things we wouldn't. And so it is really job number one for us to make sure that our neighbors in our neighborhoods feel the same prosperity that everybody else has. Part of this is people in my role have to go out and earn the trust of the community. And it's been about a year, and I feel good about things, but I know I still have a long way to go. So we have to work very hard to make people feel like whatever we do is they're part of it, not that somebody from the outside is doing this.
In the aftermath of Dr. King's death, there were riots in cities across the country, including here in Wilmington. Many of the same issues, jobs, education, racial imbalances, were at the root of that unrest. We hope that by having the conversation, we can continue to search for answers.
And that is first for this week. We thank you for watching. Check out Delaware News online at WHYY.org/news. For Shirley Min, I'm Mark Eichman. Have a great week.